Johnson's main emphasis or main concern when it came to domestic politics is his reform program that was referred to as the Great Society. And it had a couple different components to it. Basically, it's a reform program that was designed to change American society for the greater good. And two of the most important parts of this program was the war on poverty and civil rights reform. Those two issues were extremely important to President Johnson, and he, among some people, gets a lot of credit for using the power of the presidency to take on two issues that had largely been ignored by most presidents: poverty and civil rights. In fact, Johnson's greatest accomplishment domestically has to be, without a doubt, the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was a huge work in progress. You got Martin Luther King right there. You have lawmakers, and of course, President Johnson signing this piece of legislation. It's at the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X actually meet for the only time in their lives that they did meet, and were photographed very briefly. Civil Rights Act of 1964 does a couple different things. Basically bans segregation in public facilities. There were different laws, Brown versus Board of Education, court decisions that had addressed this issue. This is a federal law passed by Congress in '64, therefore banning segregation in public facilities. Not just making a law about banning, but it gives the power of the federal government to fight segregation. If a state was found to be violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the federal government can take money away from them. The power of the purse. You have money that is given from the federal government for various things: transportation, education, a lot of different things. If they are found to be violating this, that money could be taken away. In addition, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 creates the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, basically banning job discrimination based upon things like religion, national origin, sex, and race. So all these different things are being put in place with the goal of addressing the lack of civil rights in American life. Also a part of this law was the federal government could take money away from states that disenfranchised African Americans. So it deals with the issue of voting as well. All my life been broke, but it really don't matter no more. And they wonder why we had this way. Everyone's gonna be okay. In 1962, actually before Johnson takes office, there was a book called The Other America by a author, Michael Harrington. And he wrote this book, and basically the big message of this book was that there was a tremendously large number of Americans who were living in poverty. They had bad diets, they lived in poor health conditions, they had poor housing, bad health, they had very little hope of getting out of this. The New Deal, the welfare state that was created, was incapable of providing them with the means of emerging from poverty. And it really kind of opened up the eyes of a lot of Americans to this real problem of poverty in America. People who had fell out of the safety net or were unable to be helped by it. And Johnson, in 1964, actually says the Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice. And a big part of this program was this effort at poverty relief. All my life been broke, but it really don't matter no more. And they wonder why we had this way. Everyone's gonna be okay. And you get the Economic Opportunity Act. The Office of Economic Opportunity is established, which basically is going to address the issue of poverty in the nation. You have programs being created by the federal government, Job Corps, train people in job skills, get them out of just getting government assistance and actually get them a job that they can provide themselves with the basic means of support. Project Head Start was created under this war on poverty, free pre-K education for preschool age children, so that young people could get that head start that they were lacking by being unable to pay for preschool, therefore being denied the basic education tools they need to be successful later on in life. So you have all these different kind of laws being put forth, programs being created by the War on Poverty. Not everyone likes them. In fact, there's a lot of criticisms of the Great Society. Republicans felt that this was too much government spending. This was big government. This was deficit spending. How are you paying for these things? This is way too much liberal reform. There was a resentment towards the racial liberalism, the civil rights components. There was reaction to the social welfare programs. You know, the New Deal had provoked reactions from people. The Great Society is going to provoke even more. In fact, you get Republicans reacting very, very harshly to the Great Society, and most famously by the emergence of this guy, Senator Barry Goldwater from, I believe he was from Arizona. And once again, the kind of same kind of comments that were made under the New Deal and other programs, this idea that big government, the deficit spending, racial liberalism, and this idea that by creating all these government programs, you're creating dependency, that people are going to become dependent upon the government, they're going to be unable to do for themselves, to fend for themselves, and that this is actually counterproductive. And these issues still emerge today when it comes to the government trying to do things, whether it be Obama's healthcare plan or other issues. The problem, though, for Johnson was he has not just domestic opposition, but his foreign policy was causing conflict at home as well. And that's the war in Vietnam, which we'll get into in class. In the election of 1964, well, Johnson is running against Barry Goldwater, and Goldwater is running, and Johnson's running as well. And you get some pretty interesting political ads being aired. The power of the television, of course, being an important component of education, or politics rather, at this time. This is the very famous Lyndon Johnson Daisy commercial.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Miss White, could you call 5133, please?
6.
Apparently this young girl does not know how to count correctly. Just in case you could not hear that total error, she needs some Project Head Start or something, because instant replay it.
5, 7, 6.
Oops.
6.
Oops.
8.
Okay.
9.
Yeah.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So both sides during the election try to use the Cold War and the threat of atomic war to get the votes of the American people. Johnson was opposing the Republican Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was opposing the racial liberalism, the new liberalism. He criticized the Cold War stalemate. We weren't really kind of getting the win against the Soviets. In fact, part of the campaign, Goldwater kind of referenced that he would be willing to use nuclear weapons. So that commercial was designed to kind of bring to the attention of the American public, do you want a guy like Barry Goldwater who may be willing to use weapons that could be quite deadly to the United States as well? Johnson wins very easily. The Republicans carry very few states. He gets his state of Arizona and a few states in the South because of the reaction to, of course, Johnson's programs. And what you see is Johnson in his second term energized to continue his reforms, the Great Society. In fact, you get a bunch of legislation continuing, for example, the war on poverty.
All my life been poor, but it really don't matter no more. And they wonder why we act this way. Let me go
fact, these programs like Head Start, Job Corps do have real benefits. The poverty rate, the percent of people who are poor in America, drops dramatically in the period of time throughout the 60s. Infant mortality rates decline as more and more people are being granted access to health insurance. You can get programs that are still around today, for instance.
World's greatest.
Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly, program that is very popular with older age people today. Medicare program, health insurance for those over the age of 65. You also get programs like Medicaid, health insurance for the poor and the disabled. So these types of programs that are providing for basic needs of those people in America that are the most vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, are very popular in some areas. You also get other things. It's not just poverty and civil rights. You get the Clean Quality, Water Quality and Clean Air Act, which basically increases the percent of wilderness areas that are protected. You get the Quota Act. You get the Quota Acts of the 1920s actually abolished under the Immigration Act of 1965. One of the big problems was the quotas were preventing people from areas of the world that were seen as undesirable. Southern Eastern Europe, Asian countries, Latin American countries, African countries. With the Immigration Act of 1965, it eliminates quotas, therefore opening up America to a number of different groups of Americans or immigrants that will become Americans. Some people, some historians have called this the browning of America. You get people coming in huge numbers from Latin America, huge numbers of people coming from places like Vietnam, Cambodia, so on. So this is part of the Great Society, immigration reform, environmental protections, health insurance, poverty, civil rights, and many, many others. There's a whole bunch in your book. Read about them, know about them, blah, blah, blah. In fact, if you wanted to really know every damn program that was a part of the Great Society, there were quite a number. And they go from different areas. You got poverty issues, you got issues with city and housing and urban development, you have issues of education, discrimination with civil rights acts. You get, for example, the 24th Amendment, which bans the poll taxes that were being used. You get the Immigration Act, which I just mentioned. You get environmental, water quality, wilderness protection. You don't need to know them all, know the big ones. Even consumer advocacy, truth in packaging. So, reinforcing existing laws that were around since the Progressive era. Not everything was great, though. Not all the programs worked. Many of them cost a lot of money, and their performance was debatable at best. Many of them did create dependence. There was some truth in the concerns amongst those who said that these programs create a kind of dependent population, a big brother government that's just kind of doing everything. Others were quite successful and are still around today. For example, Medicare, Medicaid. They are expensive, though. And one of the big problems for Johnson was the war in Vietnam. Martin Luther King once said you can't have both guns and butter. And that idea was you can't spend money, the government can't spend money on a war in Vietnam and hope to have money left for domestic spending at home. So it became very, very difficult. By 1966, 20% or 20 times more money was spent on the war in Vietnam than on poverty programs. And King said, basically, the war on poverty was shot down in the battlefields of Vietnam. And so the Great Society did not live up to its expectations amongst Democrats, liberals, and
That's bullshit.
you have the very real realities
That's bullshit.
that I just mentioned.
That's bullshit.
And as a result, things don't work out perfectly. So if you get a question about to what extent did the Great Society reform American society, there were positives, but there also were negatives. Make sure you kind of, when you read, pay attention to those two areas. The positives, though, were significant. So it's very easy to kind of dismiss the Great Society, the war in Vietnam, this type of thing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a significant move step forward.
Daddy? Fred Kyle told me you don't understand the importance of voting. Apparently you haven't heard of my vote or die campaign. Vote or die? What the hell does that even mean? What do you think it means?
The Freedom Summer is kind of occurring at the same time. This is not a result of Johnson or the government, but basically organizations such as Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC as it was called, organized voting registration drives in Mississippi. They set up freedom schools teaching people how to pass the voting test and to register people to vote. And many people in the civil rights movement saw the issue of voting as essential to full equality. And that was the key to power in Southern life. These individuals basically went down, white and black civil rights individuals, belonging to different organizations, and once again, they were violently attacked. Some of them, such as the plaque you see, were in fact murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan, who were angry that these individuals would try to stop or to change the Southern way of life. And to give you an idea of kind of how bad it was in Mississippi, African Americans were 42% of the population, but only 5% of those registered to vote. So there was a big gap in the kind of power of the ballot that was taking place. So you have these freedom schools being set up. They're being harassed by not just the KKK, but law enforcement. You have fire bombings continuing. You have...
You gotta fight for your right!
Individuals, once again, marching. There's the famous Civil Rights March in 1965 from Selma to Montgomery, where civil rights groups come together, marching nonviolently, trying to get the issue of voting brought to the attention of the nation and the state governments. Once again, using nonviolence. And you can see very clearly these protests were not just confined to that one year or that one city or that one southern state, but talking about this test must go, we want the right, do we have a constitution, all of these things, and even when peaceful, just basically exercising fundamental rights found in the First Amendment, African Americans very often were, and civil rights groups were arrested, beaten. In fact, these are images of some of the protests, the marches, the peaceful marches, and the police beating down those individuals and approaching those individuals with violence to intimidate. And more images of that taking place. Tear gas, clubbings, this type of thing. Johnson, once again, is realizing that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not go far enough when it comes to the issue of voting. And while it did do some good, got a really classic picture of Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson.
Daddy? Fred Kyle told me you don't understand the importance of voting. Apparently you haven't heard of my vote or die campaign. Vote or die? What the hell does that even mean? What you thinking?
And you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And basically what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did is it invalidated the use of any test, literacy test, poll taxes, which the amendment that I mentioned earlier had also done, any device that was used to deny the right to vote. And not only that, but federal examiners, federal officials would go into the South to register voters in states that had disenfranchised African Americans. And really, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the first time since Reconstruction that you have the federal government going in, protecting, advocating, supporting the rights of African Americans to vote. And over the next couple of years, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 will transform Southern politics. You will once again see the emergence of black politicians holding office in Southern states, which had not happened since Hiram Revels and other black leaders were for a very short time in office during radical Reconstruction. And the results are immediate. It doesn't change things completely, but African Americans have the right to vote and are protected in that, exercising that right. Now here's what happens. This is one of those important turning points. You have a lot of progress taking place in that period of time between World War II 1965. A lot of things are going on. Military is desegregated. Brown versus Board of Education, Martin Luther King, Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, the federal amendments. You have a lot of different kind of protests that are kind of bringing the issue to the national attention. So things were improving. However, it wasn't going fast enough. Life in America was changing, but it was not being revolutionized.
There was a riot on the streets, tell me where were you? You were sitting home watching your TV while I was participating in some anarchy. First spot.
And the kind of slow pace of change, or the continuing problems that were in American society, erupt in a huge riot that will begin in Los Angeles and Watts in 1965. Basically what happens is there was, once again, conflict between white police officers harassing young African Americans, and the city of Los Angeles and Watts in particular will explode in a huge riot, burning, looting. Many people are going to be killed, something like over 30 individuals, or nearly 1,000 are going to be injured. Riots are going to take place in other cities across America. You're going to get over 200 people losing their lives in riots in the mid-60s. Thousands of people arrested, thousands of people injured. And for a lot of Americans, especially white America, they don't quite get it. Now, at the moment that things are changing, things are getting better, we have these riots. Why is this taking place? And these are just different images of those riots, looting taking place. And what tends to happen in riots is it's not organized. It's not a coherent political protest. It's a result of a lot of issues: poverty, racial profiling, police abuse, all these things, and it just erupts. And you have random acts of looting, random acts of violence, and this occurs all over the U.S., including in Watts. 1968, the nation actually had an investigation, the Kerner Commission, and their goal was to figure out, why is this occurring? Why are these race riots occurring at the very moment that many goals of the civil rights movement were being achieved? Why is it occurring when we have the desegregation beginning? Why is it occurring when you have voting rights being achieved? Why is this occurring at this very moment where change is seeming to be occurring? And the Kerner Commission basically says very bluntly that America was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. They use the language of previous court cases and say that police brutality, urban poverty, substandard education in inner city schools, racial profiling, lack of opportunity, and all these other issues were still a very real problem, and race was playing an essential role in this. And there were those individuals who felt that things were not going fast enough towards change. In fact, if you take a look at this chart, you could see by looking at it that the white and black family income, the gap that was occurring, was not rapidly decreasing. And what you see happening is, as a result of this kind of slow change, even though there was change, and if you look at it in that 10-year period, it's a lot of change compared to post-Civil War to 1950s. But many people said, we need something more. And you get this emergence of the black radical movement. People who say, we must go further, we must demand more. You get people like Malcolm X. Malcolm X is an interesting individual. Let me play a little clip of what he had to say about the race problem.
One white man named Lincoln supposedly fought the Civil War to solve the race problem, and the problem is still here. Another white man named Lincoln, again the same white man, issued the Emancipation Proclamation to solve the race problem. The problem is still here. Some more white liberals came along with the 13th, 14th, and 5th Amendments, which were supposed to solve the race problem. The problem is still here. 9 years ago, 9 more white liberals, so-called, came up with what they call a Supreme Court desegregation decision, and the problem is still here. And then another white man named Kennedy came along running for president and told Negroes Negroes what all he was going to do for them if they voted for him, and they voted for him 80%. He's been in office now for 3 years, and the problem is still here. When police dogs were biting black women and black children and black babies in Birmingham, Alabama, that Kennedy talked about what he couldn't do because no federal law had been violated. And as soon as the Negroes exploded and began to protect themselves and got the best of the crackers in Birmingham, then Kennedy sent for the troops. And there was no, he didn't have any new law. When he sent for the troops when the Negroes erupted, than he had at the time when whites were erupting. So we are within our rights and with justice, with justification, when we express doubt concerning the ability of the white man to solve our problem, and also when we express doubt concerning his integrity, concerning his sincerity. Because you will have to confess that the problem has been around here for a long time, and whites have been saying the same thing about it for the past 100 years, and it's no nearer a solution today than it was 100 years ago.
In fact, people began to really support the sentiments of people like Malcolm X, who had the name Malcolm Little growing up. His father was a member of the Garvey movement, the Back to Africa movement of the 1920s. His mother was white. There's strong evidence to suggest that his father was killed by the Klan for his involvement. Growing up, he was very much into a lot of trouble. He was in prison for drug use and robbery and whatnot. And when he's in prison, he converts to Islam. He joins the Nation of Islam. He comes out of prison in the 1950s and takes the name Malcolm X, X being the symbol for the unknown in mathematics and the symbol for Malcolm of the lack of a black identity, because their heritage, their name, their culture was stripped of them throughout the institution of slavery. Malcolm X is going to play a very important role. He is going to talk very passionately about civil rights as a member of the Nation of Islam. There's so much interesting stuff about Malcolm X. We will be watching a film about him when the AP exam's done. And for many, he would say things by any means necessary. He talked about ballots don't work, bullets will. There's this kind of simplification of Malcolm X that he wanted to use violence to achieve racial equality or to racial separatists. There are a number of kind of complexities in this. He went through a variety of changes throughout his life. He eventually was removed from the Nation of Islam. There was a moment where he didn't want to work with white civil rights organizations or even other civil rights organizations. He changes his mind later on. He goes to Mecca, goes through this whole experience. But unfortunately, we don't really know what would happen with Malcolm, because in February 1965, he was assassinated in front of his family by gunmen affiliated with the Nation of Islam. So you have this kind of battle. And what's important about Malcolm X and other black radical movements is it reflects this anger with the slow pace of change. There's Malcolm and Martin Luther King. Some quotes, because it's often portrayed as if these guys were complete 100% enemies, and there was an evolution, and we don't really know, because Malcolm X was killed if he would have eventually worked with other civil rights leaders such as King. King was killed later on. He got the Peace Prize, we got the problem. If I'm following a general and he's leading me into battle and the enemy tends to give him rewards or awards, I get suspicious of him, especially if he gets a peace award before the war is over. Another quote, I'll say nothing against him. At one time, the whites in the U.S. called him a racialist and an extremist and a communist. Then the black Muslims came along, and the whites thanked the Lord for Martin Luther King. I want Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. I really did come thinking I could make it easier. If the white people realize what the alternative is, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King. So Malcolm X and Martin Luther King play both very important roles, as do many other groups. And once again, though, the end goal is the same: freedom, equality, things like that. A lot of other individuals kind of emerge during this time. A boxer who was quite famous. He won the heavyweight boxing title in 1964. Cassius Clay converts to Islam in the same year, changes his name to Muhammad Ali, decides to evade the draft and not go to war in Vietnam. He is stripped of his title as a result of this, of taking this stand, and he is prevented from boxing for quite a while as a result of his political beliefs. And if you go into B15 and look on the back wall, you will see a poster with a quote from Muhammad Ali talking about the war in Vietnam.
You gotta fight for your right.
And this idea of Black Power, the Black Power movement, people like Stokely Carmichael talked about it and referred to themselves as members of the Black Power movement. Black Power is a term that emphasizes this idea of racial pride, the desire for African Americans to achieve equality, this idea of using much more aggressive actions in order to achieve this goal. These individuals, like Malcolm, like Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, Stokely Carmichael, you get people from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Members were becoming more and more critical of this nonviolent passive approach. 68, you get two Olympic athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, actually during the Olympic ceremonies in Mexico City give the Black Power salute in Mexico. And they got in a lot of trouble for this symbolic act of protest. They were giving this Black Power fist in the air as a symbol of their solidarity with the movement. Other groups, you have the Black Panthers that are actually created in the late 60s in Oakland, California. African American militant group, people like Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and basically they really believed that revolution was the only way to achieve freedom. They urged African Americans to arm themselves, self-help, violence if necessary. They were very famous for having shootouts with the police in the streets of Oakland. Many of the members were killed or arrested by FBI informants who were spying on them. They do some good things in this neighborhoods of Oakland. They create a sense of racial pride. Huey Newton himself, one of the founders, is eventually arrested for killing a police officer. A lot of people felt he did not do it, was unjustly convicted, but nonetheless, he does go to jail, and the movement has difficulty keeping up its momentum. Tupac Shakur, his mother was a member of the Black Panthers, so he was influenced by her teachings and thoughts and so on and so forth. And these are just different images of Black Panther power, Black Power movement. They did do things like community development, registering people to vote, things of that nature, and this type of thing. In the Black Radical movement, a big part of it was this kind of celebration of your Black identity. And you get not just, things such as equality or the end of segregation or voting rights or police profiling or things like that. You also get the creation of Black Studies, African Studies departments, classes on campuses, voter registration, this idea of the Black is Beautiful movement, celebrating your African identity and heritage. And these are just examples of that. This idea of celebrating Kwanzaa as a symbol of your racial pride. Another aspect of this is the women's rights movement. There were other voices of protest. The most famous organization when it came to women's rights is NOW, National Organization of Women. There is Muhammad Ali on the top left. You have other groups like the Chicano rights movement, most famously known by Cesar Chavez. You have the Native American movement, who becomes increasingly more and more militant, trying to get greater liberty and rights granted to Native Americans who had historically been denied those. So the Native American movement. And these are a group of Chicana civil rights activists, the Brown Berets. Native Americans, a lot of different things. I'm just going to kind of rush through this because I got to go home. Inspired by the kind of rhetoric of the civil rights movement, the war on poverty for a lot of Native Americans wanted to be included in the Great Society's war on poverty. Poverty for Native Americans was extremely high compared to the national population. There was a lot of problems of alcoholism on reservations. There was a lot of problems in lack of education, things like that. Johnson does create the National Council on Indian Opportunity to give federal money to reservations to provide them with greater economic opportunities and things like that. You get the kind of formation of the Red Power movement, making fun of Columbus Day, pushing for Native American studies classes on campuses, criticizing Thanksgiving and celebrating Native culture, and ultimately the takeover of Alcatraz Island in 1969, where a group of militant Native Americans took over the rock Alcatraz for 19 months, claiming that it was Native American land that was unjustly taken from the tribe. And for 19 months, they maintained control of that island as a political protest. Chicano rights movement, Latinos were quickly becoming the nation's largest minority group, also began to kind of press for greater equality. There was a famous case in California that dealt with desegregation before Brown versus Board of Education that actually dealt with Latino youth. You get people like Cesar Chavez, the head of the United Farm Workers Union, and Chavez was born in Arizona and worked with people like Dolores Huerta and fighting for, there's Dolores Huerta in her youth, fighting for greater equality for Chicanos and specifically for farmers, using nonviolence, very much based upon the Catholic faith and all this type of thing. There is a very handsome man with Dolores Huerta at a Cesar Chavez march back a couple of years ago when I had less gray hair. And interestingly enough, it was Filipino immigrants who were early organizers of this movement. One of the famous ones is Philip Veracruz. Over on the street, I forget the name of the street, by Belmont, there's a park with a mural of Filipino American and Filipino immigrant history. Philip Veracruz is on that mural. There's a park there or a garden or something. So there's that. So you have the United Farm Workers talking about the issue of labor and workers' rights, but it's not just the farm workers. You get other individuals, you know, you got the mass boycott of grapes throughout the late 60s, Cesar Chavez with the hunger strike and becomes this kind of symbolic figure. And of course, Cesar Chavez Boulevard is right up near our campus. And we have marches and so on that celebrate that history. Keep in mind, there was a tremendous amount of discrimination towards people of Latino or even Asian or women or African American different identities. You have, you know, Operation during the Great Depression, repatriation, you know, a lot of long history of discrimination. These are signs that were common, you know, in various states with large Latino populations. There becomes a growing sense of creating an identity and a pride of being Chicano, Mexican American, or in being other groups. The other groups from mainly Guatemala, El Salvador will come later in the late 70s, 80s, 90s. But you get the formation of groups such as MECHA. The first MECHA was formed in 1967, talking about teaching Chicano history. You get actually something that occurred in Los Angeles, the big walkouts, in which students at schools such as Lincoln High, Jefferson, and so on and so forth walk out to protest the lack of quality education, the lack of bilingual education, the lack of Latino teachers. Very much a part of this civil rights movement. You get the formation of the Brown Berets and other individuals who are fighting for greater equality, both men and women, Latinos. Women's rights. Like I mentioned before, you have the National Organization for Women that was actually created in 1966. Women had not been sitting idly by, nor were any of the other groups, but the 60s kind of is an explosion of activism. Women had been involved in various different things throughout the last, you know, many decades, starting with the Seneca Falls Declaration back in 1848. Women's began to rebel very much against this kind of, you know, inequality, this lack of opportunity. You know, once suffrage was achieved in the 20s, there was a kind of a lost momentum. Many of the women's rights organizations, NASA, you know, they got their goal, which was the right to vote, but there were still problems in American society, such as unequal distribution of wealth between men and women, the kind of different expectations for the different groups. So you get organizations such as now, the National Organization for Women, emerging, dealing with these things, and just something simple such as protesting the depiction of women in the entertainment industry, in things such as the Miss America Beauty Contest. There's a whole bunch of things you can talk about in terms of the women's rights movement as well. You get individuals such as Betty Friedan writing books called The Feminine Mystique, and The Feminine Mystique is really seen as the Bible of the women's right feminist movement. She talked about this idea that women are supposed to only be mothers and wives and play no other roles, and she criticized it. It really outlines a lot of feminist thought and really powerful ideas regarding the role of women in American society. And there's Betty Friedan protesting with other individuals of now about things like the Equal Rights Amendment, about things like gender equality and wages and things like that. The issue of reproductive rights becomes very important. The pill is created in the 60s. The issue of abortion becomes central in the early 70s. Remember, for a very long time, even talking about birth control was seen as obscene, and people back in the 20s, such as, I forget the names right now, but people like Emma Goldman and others were deported for talking about sexual freedom and things like that. So you have the pill that gives women a greater degree of choice over their own bodies. And there's a whole bunch of different kind of women rights activists that emerge over a variety of issues. The pill, abortion, Roe versus Wade hits in 1973. Roe versus Wade is the Supreme Court decision that deals with or grants the right of abortion. And the case really has to do with privacy, and the Supreme Court's decision, of course, allows for abortion. And you get two sides to this. In fact, it's a battle we're still dealing with today. On one side, you have this idea of choice and reproductive rights, and on the other side, you have those who believe that abortion is sin, abortion should be illegal. And forget abortion, even the issue of should health insurance companies have to pay for contraception is still being discussed in 2012. So all this stuff is kind of being done. Along with the other groups, there's a greater emphasis on trying to get women's rights and women's studies, gender studies classes in colleges and universities, and a greater degree of acknowledgement of the role that women play. You even have other movements. They're not going to ask you a whole bunch about this stuff on the AP exam, but the Yellow Power movement, Asian rights movement. Remember, there was a long history, whether it be Japanese internment, the Gentleman's Agreement, Chinese Exclusion Act, towards people who were Asian or Asian immigrants. You get various Asian organizations pushing for greater equality. These are actually individuals protesting the arrest of Huey Newton and talking about yellow power. For years in American history, there was this idea of the yellow peril, that somehow America was being taken over, mainly from immigrants from China or Japan. And so there begins to be a kind of emergence of a activist Asian American population and others. And I'm going to pause there for a moment.